What's up, my Nimbugs? It's your boy Coder of the Elestrals here, and today we're bringing to you guys something a little bit different on the channel, something a little bit new, and something I don't think anyone is doing in the space currently that we wanted to experiment with. So basically, we've been analyzing the results of multiple tournaments that have been happening over the course of the last few months, and we've been noticing that there's always like one or two decks that have been creeping into Top Cut that we really didn't expect to see. We did a tier list not long ago, and in this tier list, we basically categorized the decks that we figured were S tier, A tier, B tier, and so on. And there's a couple of decks on there that maybe don't deserve the spot that we gave them, or even decks that weren't on our radar at all. So we decided, let's create a new series where we test out some of these strategies that aren't the most well-known strategies or the most well-respected. We decided that because there's 4 of us, we figured we could take any deck and essentially run it through the gauntlet. So for today's video, we decided that we wanted to see whether or not Krakatuga deserved the B tier spot that we gave it. Because the thing that we need to consider is the fact that in the last webcam tournament and in the app tournament, Krakatuga has made Top Cut both times. But we of the Elestrals classified it as a B tier deck because we didn't really think that deck was as good as it seems to be performing in these Elestrals tournaments. But we figured we can't make that assumption without putting it to the test. So today we're going to be putting Krakatuga through the gauntlet. We're going to be taking Krakatuga through a rogue tier deck in Bears, an A tier deck in Penterror, and then an S tier deck in Thunder Nexus to see just how well this deck performs against each of those strategies. So without further ado, let's get into the games, and I'll explain to you guys the game plan for Krakatuga and what the idea is against each of these decks. So let's run it. So in this clash, I'm going to be playing Krakatuga against Swolelax, who's going to be playing Bears, and essentially what Bears is basically looking like nowadays is it's kind of like a watered down earth beatdown strategy or wind beatdown strategy. It's a beatdown strategy that aims to use the Bears to, generate a lot of advantage. Now, the big thing with the Krakatuga deck, from what I've noticed in deck building, is that this deck aims to stall the game out as much as possible. The primary game plan of Krakatuga is to use cards like Swolelax, like Astrabbit, in order to put some big bodies in defense and just make your opponent have to invest resources into dealing with this card. Here you'll see I cast out Mistation. It's going to get Poison Tipped Arrow, but that is the game plan of the deck. For a 1 cost from Mistation, my opponent's forced to expend 2 spirits in order to deal with it, which is why my opponent here playing some Astrabbits onto the field doesn't really bother me, because realistically the goal of the deck is, even if you don't find Krakatuga, you want to whittle your opponent's resources down so low that Eruption puts them within game range. So here, I'm just going to be setting a ton of back row and not really committing a bunch of guys to the board, because as long as my opponent doesn't commit a single Celestial that's able to deal with my Swolelax, I have zero fear whatsoever. The primary game plan is just going to be to let him play as much as he needs to play until I can get him low enough that I can punish with an Eruption or casting out a Krakatuga with an Ascension in order to burn the remaining spirits that they have left in their spirit deck. So this deck will utilize cards like Swolelax to search out some pretty powerful Fire Elestrals. It'll let you get your Necruff or your Warmite in order to allow you to deal with some problematic Elestrals, but you'll notice my opponent isn't casting any problematic Elestrals right now. The moment they cast out something like a Viscerus or something, that's a card that I'm going to have to deal with, but until that happens, I don't have to deal with anything that they put out onto the field. So right now, you'll notice I'm at a pretty significant spirit count advantage, and I can even allow myself to use Nectar of the Gods to try to dig as much as possible for a Krakatuga because I'm still in spirit advantage here. The primary idea with this deck is you don't want to push until you have to push. You want to just stall as much as possible, and then once you have the ability to push a little bit, like here with the Galaxy on the field, I'm able to push just a little bit and whittle down my opponent's resources even a little bit more. You'll notice them using cards like Gorgon's Gaze, cards like PTA, even if they wanted to try to use Tsunami, which most of my cards are impervious to, this deck actually shines really well against most of these back row because these back row often cost 2 spirits to clear 1 spirit cards. So for that reason, I can just let my opponent waste their resources down here. So Swolelax has a massive board, a bunch of cards on the field, a Kindleo that can start picking away at my Elestrals, but I don't actually have to fear most of them, specifically because they're not going to be dealing with my entire board. And now here, he's passing turn, not able to clear my Swolelax on my Galaxy. I can just turn them all to defense or leave them all in attack with the Galaxy's effect and just stall my opponent out. Here I have a Necruff, which is a big beater as well. So this deck kind of plays similar to the 5's deck, to the 5 guys deck that just aims to put a bunch of big guys on the board, but it does so a lot slower, but actually punishes the opponent because they need to invest a ton of resources into dealing with my things. You'll notice his spirit count goes down to 5 here, and he's within 2 eruption range of losing the game. Now, the big thing that's a little bit scary in this matchup is that bears are fire Elestrals, meaning that the eruption will only burn my opponent for 1 rather than burn him for 3. So those are the only cards that I really need to worry about, is not letting Swolelax have any fire Elestrals remaining on the field. Here he's investing a lot of resources here in order to get those fire Elestrals, because that's his game plan to win the game, and if he doesn't get to those, he's not able to win. But none of these cards are able to essentially clear the wall that I've built. Like, he clears the Galaxy, but I still have the 2 Smoltuga, and next turn those Smoltugas are just going to defense, and there's no way he can deal over it. Same thing with the Foamy, right? Foamy is another stall card. Foamy can allow me to go into something like a Mestation to put a 6 defense on the board, making it significantly more difficult for my opponent to deal with it. So it was in this game, and mind you, this is my first game that I was playing with Krakatuga, I was realizing just how much control this deck actually has. Realistically speaking, most decks in Elestrals only have control through back row, but this deck actually has a significant amount of control through tempo. All you gotta do is make sure that your opponent isn't able to clear the stuff you have on field, and you don't need to push, because your opponent can't win unless they push themselves. So with the fact that they have to push, you basically just let them whittle down their own spirit count to around 3, and then Eruption just closes out the game. Right now, I haven't even gotten to a Krakatuga so far, and I've already applied enough pressure to basically scare Swolelax into a position where, if I do have the Eruption, I essentially just win the game. Dealing with the Smoltugas, dealing with the Foamies, are basically as difficult as dealing with an Ashrabbit in any other matchup. So you just have a significant number of cards that are able to simply wall the game and not allow your opponent to push and attack onto your Spirit deck. You'll notice here he gets a Viscerus, which is one of the most aggressive Elestrals in the game, but with only 1 Spirit left in his Spirit deck, not only is he within Eruption range to just lose the game, he's also in a position where he can't even utilize the effect of Viscerus very well in order to get out more bodies on the field, because if he has 0 spirits, he's not able to play the game. So here, he can't even make a push because he's not able to clear my Elestrals in any meaningful way. So he's just leaving his Viscerus and attack and passing. But at this point, I cast Eruption and close out the game. Very, very powerful duel. I'll be honest, this Bears deck is not the best deck I've ever seen. It is a fun Rogue tier deck from what we've decided on our tier list. We did put the Bears at Rogue. The deck is not very fantastic, but as you can see, Krakatuga, even without Krakatuga himself, we just utilized the water cards to stall and the fire cards in order to give us some amount of push with something like Necruff or the Warmite to deal with any problematic cards, and then we just sat until our opponent's spirit count was low enough for Eruption to win the game. So with that being said, against Rogue, this deck performs extremely well. So here I'm going to be doing a clash against Josh, who is piloting the Penterror Wind Toolbox deck. Now, the big thing to keep in mind is that we wanted to test our theory that Krakatuga actually has a fantastic matchup against the Penterror strategy. The primary reason why is because the Penterror strategy utilizes a lot of spirits early on in order to get to a Penterror. It's a deck that has a significant amount of push, but it's a push that costs a lot of spirits. So we wanted to see, against a deck that aggroes a lot, are they able to out-aggro our stall strategy, or are they not able to and simply utilize too many resources, and in doing so will in turn put themselves so low that they're susceptible to a Krakatuga or an Eruption for game. So here you'll notice Josh is starting off with the Ashrabbit, which is not really where he wants to start out with. It is a strong card, but it does make it so that he doesn't have a lot of bodies onto the board, or bodies that can get him to Penterror. And here I did draw the Veritaqua, which is the perfect response for the Ashrabbit. And Josh's deck, the Wind deck, utilizes a lot of tech cards such as P-Gust or such as Sorlet in order to deal with problematic cards on the field. Sorlet is a card that is a little bit scary when you're playing the Krakatuga deck, specifically because your card like Smoltuga has very little attack, and usually you want it to just sit in defense to wall your opponent, and the Sorlet is able to deal with that. However, here, you'll notice I take the advantage pretty early on because Josh just isn't able to stick an Elestral onto the board. When you see Galaxy, you essentially play this deck as if it was 5s. So being able to have that 5s strategy and be able to push onto the opponent and basically force them to commit more to the board, otherwise you're just going to win by battle, makes it so that they have to commit a lot of stuff to the board in order to deal with the Elestrals that you have, and if they do that, in turn, they're playing directly into your Krakatuga strategy. So being able to play this deck as kind of like a hybrid Krakatuga 5s deck once you draw Galaxy is actually significantly more powerful than we expected it to be. The Hydrake comes down here, and you'll notice, like I said, the Hydrake is an expensive line. So here, he can go all the way up into a Penterror, but let's see how this works out for him. He uses the Hydrake and decides to crash into the Veritaqua to just beat over it because he decides he actually doesn't want to commit a lot of resources. But here, Krakatuga hits the board, and Krakatuga with a Galaxy is really expensive. It's really powerful. It deals a lot of attack. I use the Krakatuga. It gets Gorgon's Gaze, unfortunately, but it does the job. 2 spirits for 2 spirits or 2 spirits for 3 spirits. I'm still up on spirit count here. So it actually doesn't matter, and he's forced to use the Gorgon's Gaze because otherwise this Krakatuga is not only dealing 3 spirits worth of damage, it's also swinging indirect to deal a whole lot more. So Krakatuga, especially with the Galaxy on the board, is very scary. Here he's going to use the Sorlet, going to expend the Spirit to turn the Krakatuga to defense, which, again, like I said, Sorlet is a card that scares us, but Tsunami is a card that works very well in our strategy and, you know, allows us to play into whatever Josh is going to put on the board. Here we go, Krakatuga to burn 2 more, putting Josh down on not very many spirits, and then we commit an Elestral to the board, and that's enough to just swing over and attack for game. Josh could attempt to turn his, you know, his Hydrake into a Twindra, but then at that point it would put his spirit count to 0, and he wouldn't be able to do a whole lot. So against a deck that actually aggroes quite a lot, such as the Penterror deck, or even against the 5 deck that likes to commit big guys to the board, it just likes to run out a big dude every single turn, if they're not able to deal with the guys that you have on board, it forces them to have to commit even more to deal with your big defense guys, your Ashtrabbit, your Krakatuga, your Smoltuga, or even your Galaxy, which is a 5 attacker at that point. It means that they have to commit so much more to the board that they just play into your game plan. Here I didn't draw Eruption, I drew the Krakatuga, which essentially has the same effect, but being able to whittle down those extra resources, even though it costs 2 to burn 3, it's good enough because your strategy plays slow and doesn't force you to commit a lot of resources to the board, whereas your opponent's strategy has to play a lot faster to outpace you, meaning that they play into that Krakatuga strategy a lot more. So against even the Penterror deck, Krakatuga actually shined quite well. It actually got to show that the deck performs quite well against these huge, big aggro decks. And now I'm going to be playing against Caleb, who's on the Thunder Nexus strategy, one of the decks that is considered to be the best deck in the game currently. Now, we wanted to test this specifically against Thunder Nexus because Thunder Nexus is a deck that offers a lot of control, and we wanted to see whether or not Krakatuga playing against a control strategy, if it performed as well as it did against an aggro strategy. So here you'll notice I'm running out with the Smoltuga, which is an optimal start to my play. I'm adding the Warmite here because I do want to be able to deal with any big monsters, big Elestrals that he might run out onto the field. He starts out with an Ashtrabbit, which is exactly where the Thunder Nexus deck wants to start. And the big thing to consider here is that the Thunder Nexus deck actually has burn cards of their own. So I think the Thunder Nexus deck actually has a decent toolbox to actually go spirit for spirit against the Krakatuga strategy. So me playing slowly actually isn't the optimal strategy against the Thunder Nexus deck, because with cards like Toxion or cards like Sparkit, they can whittle down my resources and make it so that my slow game will not be able to outpace their slow game. Thunder Nexus is a deck that can play extremely slowly, and here you'll notice a Viscerus that does connect and unfortunately does give Caleb a good amount of advantage over me in this current position. I do have the Necrof that can deal over his attack over his defense position Viscerus, but that's not going to do a whole lot. The Warmite has to connect onto the attack position Viscerus. There's a poison tipped arrow that comes down, putting the Warmite down to 1, which is unfortunate. But here, you'll notice that even if I had cards like Galaxy, cards like Smoltuga, against a Viscerus in attack position here with a lot of back row, it's very, very difficult to pierce through, and here you see the Toxion come down, which will whittle down my resources. You'll notice that my spirit count is significantly lower than Caleb's, and this is not the position where you want to be. Even with a Mestachian on the board, like, it forces Caleb to use his poison-tipped arrow, which will whittle down his spirit count, but it doesn't allow me to stick anything to the board. And this deck really needs to wall up early on, because if it doesn't, it won't be able to do a whole lot. But the big problem with that is that even if you wall up, the Thunder Nexus deck doesn't actually need to play through your wall that you set up, because cards like Toxion can whittle you down, cards like Sparkit can whittle you down, and if both of those hit the board, you don't really have a whole lot to deal with both of those cards at the same time. So if they both hit the field, you really will not have a strong, powerful way to remove those, and then it'll just put you in a losing position. So here you'll notice I had a bunch of small Tugas, I had the Krakatuga, but Caleb just outpaced me really hard here, and frankly, he didn't even draw the best cards in his deck. He didn't see Sparkit Zeus, he saw an Astrabbit. Fortunately for him, he did see the Altar of Stars, but he didn't even need it in order to win in this position. But Altar of Stars is also another card that really, really beats the Krakatuga deck pretty significantly, and Caleb wins this game very handily. So basically, in conclusion, giving you my final thoughts on the deck, I think the deck does have a stronger game plan than we initially gave it credit for. I think the idea that the deck wants to play slow and doesn't really need to commit a whole lot to the board, because it forces your opponent to commit into your cards and in turn whittles down their spirit count, is actually a very, very powerful game plan. We've seen another deck that performed a similar sort of game plan at the last app tournament, which was a deck that didn't really apply any push at all. It was just playing a bunch of little guys that heal your spirits, and basically the game plan was kind of the same. It was forcing your opponent to commit to the field and use their resources while you just keep your resources as much as you can without committing too much to the field. The Krakatuga deck essentially aims to do the same kind of thing. However, it does have these big bombs that can just steal the game. Eruption is one of them. Krakatuga is one of them. These cards, the moment they hit the board, they basically jump scare your opponent and you're like, oh my god, what do I do with this now? Like, I can't deal with these cards. These cards can steal certain game states and certain game positions where otherwise your opponent would seemingly be leading in terms of card advantage or in board presence. So overall, do I think we misranked the Krakatuga? I'll be honest, no. I think Krakatuga does still have a spot in B tier, but I think it changes based on whether or not it's a best of 1 or a best of 3 format. We decided to go with best of 1 games, specifically because tournaments nowadays lately have been best of 1, and we genuinely think that that's the reason why Krakatuga is performing as well as it is. I don't think that if we were playing in a best of 3 format that Krakatuga would do as well as it's doing currently. Now, do I think Krakatuga has a legitimate game plan? Yes. Do I think that game plan is good enough to consistently win or top tournaments? If they continue to be best of 1, the answer is yes. And if Elestrals decided that they wanted to be best of 1 through and through, I think that Krakatuga would genuinely be an A-tier deck. But unfortunately, I think with the fact that Top Cut is best of 3 most of the time, I think in best of 3, Krakatuga does willingly deserve a spot at B tier. Frankly, specifically because after you side deck, your deck is a lot more well geared to beat Krakatuga, and if you know you're playing into Krakatuga, you can adjust your game plan accordingly. Whereas with other decks such as Thunder Nexus, such as the Earth Beatdown deck, it's a lot more difficult to adjust to those strategies and basically find yourself in a more favorable position when playing against them, rather than when you're playing against Krakatuga, where you can do that significantly a lot easier. So for that reason, do I think Krakatuga deserves its spot in B tier? Yes, it did defeat our A-tier Penterror deck, but that's because that's an aggro deck, and Krakatuga has a very, very good matchup against aggro strategies. But against something like Earth, something like Thunder Nexus, those decks control significantly better than Krakatuga does, and for that reason, I don't think Krakatuga has a very favorable matchup against them. And if it can't beat the best decks in the game, I cannot possibly, within good conscience, rate it as an A-tier deck. So I think Krakatuga still deserves its spot in B tier, but I'm willing to see if anyone is able to lab this deck out and push it all the way to the limit and get it into A tier. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this showcase of what the Krakatuga deck is able to do and what decks it's able to play against. And with that being said, I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace!